Hi everyone, welcome back to Class 101. Bryce Coe here, and today's lesson is going to be about the human form. This is a topic that could take a lifetime to realistically truly master, but I want to give you guys some shorthand tips on how I understand the human form, and hopefully that will help your understanding of its most important parts. Okay, so for materials, I'll be using the extra fine Kuretake felt pen, and I have a Band-Aid today because I cut myself while cooking. So if you need a Band-Aid, you should definitely get one as well. And be drawing in the mixed media pad as usual. Okay, so for today's lesson, we'll be going over anatomy, and we're going to start with a male figure here. I just want to reiterate that the point of this lecture is actually just to show you my shorthand for how I deal with anatomy. It's not exactly going to be, a lesson that can replace all the years of studying anatomy that I think it takes to truly master. You can think of humans just like any research topic. You're going to need to draw it a lot over and over with the intent to learn and to come up with your own rules for understanding a human to really fully grasp what's going on. But here today just to give you how I do it myself and what to look out for when you draw humans and want to make them look a little bit more anatomically correct. Okay, so for our human guy here, basically this is a really nice Sketchfab model because it has all the muscle groups kind of labeled in different colors. And to be honest, when I'm drawing a dude, I do not think of all of these different muscles. When I draw the leg, I think if he's buff, he's got some more lumps, and I kind of generally know where the lump should be. But I don't know about all these other kind of long, stringy horse muscles here. And so let's just get into the way that I draw a dude. We will ignore the face today because that's going to be the next lesson. But for now, we're just going to think of that as a rounded box with a cylindrical top. So the top of the head being here, chest here, and legs here. Okay, so like I said, kind of a cylindrical top to the head, side plane for where the ear is going to be, generally going to have like an eye line that goes around the top. The eyebrows are going to be around the top of that ear. And this is kind of our simplified human head, where this is the front plane of the box and that's the top plane of the box. Okay, so first thing that we're going to cover here is the neck. For a male neck, it's generally a bit thicker than a female. That's something you probably have understood from observation, but that's one thing that, like, as soon as you start drawing a dude, you can think like, rather than kind of pulling the neck inward like you might with a female, having it almost flush with the skull is generally okay. This guy looks a little bit buffer like that, but just having it around the same width is what I do. The next thing I focus on is finding that top plane of the box, and that means thinking about this collarbone here. This muscle version of it, you can kind of see that the collarbone sticks out in between the different bones because that's what the muscles are connected to in real life. So that's what I look for, and that's just helping me define this top plane. For a dude versus a female, you also kind of have these really strong shoulder muscles sticking out. You can see that in the back there, that this is really well defined, but they also pop up from a front view. So if you're drawing a dude, you can kind of ignore them if you think this is maybe a skinnier, less ripped, shredded, buff man. But if you want him to come off more strongly, this is where you can exaggerate this line. So you can kind of just like have that blend into the neck. I'm going to mirror it over here. And as I'm figuring out what the chest box is for a male, it's almost a lot simpler to think of their chest box as being almost all the way down until the start of the hips. And that's kind of just a box that's very slowly, very gradually becoming more and more narrow. So thinking of like this being like kind of where that chest box ends, it's almost just like almost a straight line going down this way from the top of that box. That's like the general shape. But the muscles that I look out for are obviously these two large pecs and the abs. I think that this is kind of like a little less than halfway down is where the pecs kind of would stop. And then the rest of it all the way down to the groin area is kind of like a line right down the center line of the face as well, so that you can decide how buff you want your guy to be with how many bumps you draw on this. I never really like count like it being a six-pack. I'm only doing it in front of you guys because I have this right here. But you know, if it's a really buff dude in real life, it's kind of like just a bunch of lumps, and I think it's fine to think of it that way as well. The side plane. Okay, so this is the front plane. The side plane, similarly, ribs, I think as having kind of some subtle lumps to stick out. I never pay attention to how many I draw. It's just kind of like how buff do you want the guy to be? Usually I'm not drawing a muscle man, so I just kind of do a couple lumps sticking out of here, and those gradually smooth out because the lower back around here, there's not as many things going on. So you're gonna go from however muscle you want to a smooth line to connect to that box. So yeah, see something like this, just like kind of like some slight grooves will generally be the way that I'm thinking about it. And before we go to the waist, let's cover the arms. So this right here, you know, it's not really even that different from how we were tackling the armored characters yesterday, or the armored and robotic characters. I really think that this really large shoulder muscle here, it's pretty much the same as the armor, where this is just a lump that kind of starts to transition into the tricep and bicep of this the middle part of the arm. Distinguishing a couple of these muscles though, so knowing that you can draw this line because that's defining that top muscle, but then this line also defining the bicep. So thinking still of this internally as like a box shape that's kind of just got these small lump muscles attached to it. I'm seeing this box and I'm kind of just overlaying this small rounded line to define how big of a bicep the dude has. And with the back of the arm, the one thing to pay attention to is that there can be a smaller bump for the tricep at the top. So on this side, definitely I think one simple longer line, and on the back, if you want, you can make it a little bit of a hump towards the top of the shoulder. The forearm, so yeah, you can see that like in this model here, in real life, this has a lot of different kind of like smaller muscles all coming together. So I generally don't think I'm imagining any of these muscle shapes going on. I just think that doing like kind of a few bumps going into the wrist is as complicated as I would go. I've kind of made this arm a little bit long, but it would kind of just be something more like that. So don't really worry about memorizing any of that stuff. So there's definitely multiple ways to break down the hand into multiple different parts, but for me personally, I guess I'll draw this to the side here. So you can definitely use your own hand as a reference when you're trying to figure this stuff out. Like if you ever are drawing a character and you want to understand how the hand should be posed, don't be afraid to just bust out your own hand and study how your hand works. It'll be close enough to get the general idea. But for me, when I'm thinking of a hand, I think of this as generally one kind of slanted box here. So I'll try to draw this, maybe I'll draw this here. And then this thumb here is kind of like, because of the fact that it can be articulated to move to the inside or be flat on the outside, it's good to think of that as something separate, depending on how you're posing the hand, because it's not as simple as like, oh, it's like can only articulate like that. It can move all the way around. Unlike the fingers, which generally are just going to go up and down like that and flare out a tiny bit. The thumb is a lot more agile and should be considered as a separate part. So in the case of a very flat hand, this is just like kind of a separate piece here. And then the fingers, I mentioned it briefly before, but the length of the fingers can kind of be abbreviated as the thumb and the pinky, to me, should be roughly the same, but with the thumb being thicker. So let's say that's about that, and this being about the same like that. And then a lot of times to make a pose for the hand more expressive, these fingers here can either like kind of connect a little bit, and when I do that, it just kind of like makes the hand into almost like a four-fingered hand, where it kind of adds a little bit of personality to the character as well, where it's kind of like, I think it just adds a little flavor. So I might just, depending on the pose, kind of connect those together. And they're generally a bit longer than the pinky, and then this guy is just right in between. So these are kind of like this small, medium, long. And those are the pieces I'm thinking of. Anytime I'm drawing palm side of the hand, I'm thinking about this muscle here and this muscle here. So maybe I should diagram that first. The palm side of the hand, I'm thinking about this chunk that's connected to the thumb, and this chunk, which is connected to the pinky. And I think in real life, everybody's hand is a tiny bit different, but like it's almost like this is cut into thirds, like a pizza. So like something more like those are the three chunks that are going to be moving around, and really the only ones that move around are these two on the side. This is going to be generally flat. So connecting this to some fingers here, about the same as the pinky, and this time I'll draw these two more connected and this guy sticking out. And so, like I was gonna get to before, there rarely is the hand just like flared out like that. A lot of times it's doing something. So understanding these pieces and moving those around slightly is what I'll be thinking about. So trying to, like, for example, if the thumb is going inward, then I'm gonna anchor my drawing with this part of the thumb, and then just connecting the actual finger to it, and then the pinky, like I'll get that second, and whatever it's doing, in this case I just decided to make it flare out, and then from there I'll define this last third of the hand and kind of just draw the remaining fingers. In this case I decided to bend them so that it would be, rocking out. Bending the fingers, is like kind of just understanding the three major kind of joints here, but having them be as clearly defined shapes, where it's kind of just like what I did here, where this is this longer joint second joint, and then just kind of like the third joint bending inward here. But thinking of them in these three concrete shapes is going to make that a little bit more clear when you're drawing, that like that's your understanding of how the hand is posed. I think sometimes I get myself in trouble when I kind of just like try to draw it without kind of having some of these shapes be more clearly defined. I think thinking of this line here as the separate like kind of box shape separated from these other shapes, and kind of drawing some lines to show that understanding helps me understand, you know, what I have going on with the hand. So yeah, I would never start with this part of the hand. I would always start with this thumb and this chunk here, which is like kind of like a box in its own way. Then I would just think of that first and pull out, extrude out the thumb itself. Then I'll start with the chunk for the pinky here, and then extrude out the actual finger. Okay, cool. So went on a long tangent there, but let's move back to our model. So in this case here, he's got just kind of that open hand. So I would draw that box, then I would go on to thinking about that palm part of the thumb. And if he's got all the fingers together, I might actually simplify it first as being one large shape, because I know that in real life, if they're all connected together, it's kind of easier to understand this overall shape, as opposed to like combining four like quarters of that shape together to add up to that overall shape. So simplifying it and then being like, okay, just within that, there's the four fingers after I've drawn the overall shape. That's maybe just another small tip for how I render something. Okay, so then on this side, I'll just reiterate what I did before, which is draw this shoulder muscle, think about the bicep. I always like to show and indicate the elbow either from the outside or inside. Forearm, just that little bump that I mentioned before. And then let's just do another example of the hand. I'll first think about that thumb, connect it to the finger, pinky, and then the rest of the hand. Okay, now let's move on to the waist and kind of hip groin area there. For a dude, there's not honestly too much that I usually worry about. I know internally that it's got like a really strong line on this hip that just like kind of points to the groin, and that eventually like those things hit the bottom here where the groin would be. And understanding this hip as a separate box is useful for knowing where that endpoint is, I suppose, because that endpoint is also where the butt ends. So I'm kind of drawing this from the side here, but those glutes end right at the same point. I guess in real life maybe they don't end at the same point. Well, you know, kind of hard to see exactly on this model, but because he's missing the groin, but that's generally how I think about it. Okay, I'm not a super scientific expert on this, but yeah, thinking about the butt ending there is what I do. And then kind of like I mentioned at the top here, I kind of ignore most of these like inside parts of the muscle, but this outer muscle here on that thigh is something that I'll think about. Generally, I think of it as being anchored by my kneecap, which is why I like the kneecap so much in the previous lesson. There's kind of just like one large muscle on one side of the kneecap, on the outer side of the kneecap, and then like kind of a smaller muscle on the inside part of the thigh. So as simple as these two large chunks being anchored by this circle of the kneecap. And honestly, I think for the longest time, I just would kind of generally draw some lump shapes in the knee, and knowing that they kind of are most prominent at the top, closer to the thigh, and then just having no choice but to eventually connect to the kneecap. I wouldn't really think too deeply about what's going on underneath, just saying, how muscly is this guy? Does he have like bulging stuff coming out? Then I'll just draw some bulging stuff. And that would be the other knee. For the calves, I think the front part of the leg is generally going to be pretty flat because it's just like a hard shin, and then the muscle that I'm paying attention to is back here, where it just kind of is maybe really similar to the way I think of the forearm, where it's just kind of got like a larger hump at the start and then connects down to the ankle. And this inner part here I generally think of as kind of like having a more straight line, maybe a bit of a curve, just because this shape is cylindrical depending on where you're at in it. And just mirror that over here. So hump on the back and a little bit more flat on the front. Make them a little bit more muscular on this side. Okay, and then we're down to the ankle. The ankle, like I mentioned before, I think it's great to think of as a box because it's got a very, very strong detail of that ankle bone that is always going to be on the side of the foot. You know, it's never kind of like hanging out anywhere else. So understanding it as a box and understanding that little hump for the ankle is just how I think about it, and it seems to work. From there, drawing the back of the foot as a rounded corner for that box of the ankle, and connecting this outward to be the foot. I think the foot is another thing where it's like the hand, and having an understanding of the major palm side part of the foot is what really helps me most. So I'll try to do it over here. The parts I'm thinking of for a foot are kind of the ball of the foot, which is kind of like this part here with the toes, and it's almost like maybe a miniature hand. I never pay attention to my pinkies, I feel, or not pinkies, the toes. I just feel like these four are maybe the same, and the only one that's different is going to be the big toe. But so this being one chunk where it's kind of just got that like a little bit of a palm, like the hand for the top ball of the foot. The middle part here is just connective tissue to the heel of the foot, which is important, which is kind of like there's only a handful of ways to pose a foot. And a lot of times that means that you are articulating out the ball of the foot here to make contact with the floor, or posed out. Maybe they're standing on a heel even, a high heel shoe, or they're doing the opposite and the heel of the foot is out. But it actually ends up being kind of the same thing, where it's just that's articulated separately from this ball part of the foot, which can do something like that. And as far as the ankle bone goes, it's so helpful to me. I just want to reiterate that because it appears on both sides, and I assume that it must be slightly different, but when I simplify it in the drawing, it's just going to be kind of the same general shape on both sides. And yeah, so my understanding of how I am drawing these curves for the foot has to do with understanding that there's a heel here, and then there's the ball of the foot making contact there. Okay, and so that is the simplified human anatomy for a male. And now let's move on to the female. And the female model is pretty much gonna have the same major ideas, obviously, as the male. We are the same species after all, but there's gonna be a few key differences. And one of the ones that I think is most easy to generalize is that the understanding of the arms and the neck and head, to an extent, is largely the same but slimmer. So I don't think of a male and a female arm too differently as far as the things to accentuate, just slimmer. Same for the neck. And for the head, generally it's going to be a more narrow chin, so the face becomes more slim. And otherwise, you know, it kind of depends on the female that you're drawing. Those are the basic kind of rules that I follow when drawing those parts. But the chest, hips, and legs I do think of slightly differently, just to kind of accentuate the more feminine features. So starting out with the chest, the things that we're going to look out for are basically a shorter chest box at the top, a slimmer waist, and because of that slimmer waist, a more prominent hip box. The hips on the male, generally speaking, are you know, kind of just flat all the way down, but because of that slimmer waist, the hip box here is easier to see on the female, and that hip box is also going to inform how we draw the butt and legs once we get to it. All right, so let's start drawing. And yeah, for this lesson, because we're mostly worried about the body, the head, we'll just generally think of it as being slimmer at the, or more narrow at the chin. So the side of the head, side plane there, being kind of the same all the way up into this point. This could be a female or a male at this point. And then I just think that most of the time when drawing a female, thinking of this chin being narrow is how this becomes a female head to me. Neck, just connecting it to the top of the chest box, but generally I like to make it slimmer, more thin. I mentioned this previously, but just to point it out again, the back muscle, top of that shoulder here, generally also doesn't get to be as accentuated. So it's generally just kind of like thinking of the chest box, it's just connecting to it kind of in a gradual curve, even if the figure is going to be eventually very muscular. Still going to use the collarbone to define the top of the chest box. And then this is where things get the most different as far as my understanding of the female figure. So I tend to think that the chest box for the female, as opposed to connecting all the way down to the hip box here, this is where, for me, the chest box ends. And it's kind of like if we were to draw on some of these muscles, where that rib cage kind of hits the corner of that box and where the abs would start. For the breasts, I generally simplify it as the kind of cup shapes that I see on like a bra, which is a much more solid shape to think about. You know, obviously they're very soft tissue, but thinking of it in terms of these shapes to me is just a way to get something generally anatomically correct, generally gonna like be the shape and form that you would see on a clothed model. That's what's kind of replacing the large pecs that you'd see on the male. And then the hip box and the chest box, I think generally are gonna be on top of each other. It's kind of pointing at this corner of the hip where this would be. Oh, let's see how this is further out. That's incorrect. It should be about here. This would be a really, really wide hip. And so what I do is I basically connect this line here with like kind of a curve to make that hourglass shape. But that curve is actually really informed more so by the butt. So I'm going to draw the rest of this hip box. And that likewise kind of just ends at the point where the groin area is. And around where the butt would end. I think in reality the butt can go a bit further, and because of this, like, you know, I guess tendency to draw women with larger butts than males, or accentuate that part of the body more, knowing that the curve here is kind of gonna maybe kind of mirror the curve of the waist, is kind of like that little bit of an S shape here. Or, yeah, like this, like kind of backwards S in this case on this side. But that is kind of the way that I think this curve feels the most natural and kind of maybe just my aesthetic. Okay, so here, just drawing the side, the thing I'm looking for is this connection, again, the end of the chest box being where this rib cage kind of jets out the most on the body, and then as that comes back in, this is just showing the other side, oops, of this line here, and it's going to connect to where the hip is, and from this angle you don't get to see the curve of the butt there. One of the things that I'm also conscious of when I'm drawing is that there's like kind of like a thigh gap, I suppose, is the idea. So you could see part of the same curve of the butt, like being the other butt cheek essentially. So this model's missing butt on that side, but on this side you can see that. So knowing that that is the line you're drawing, in this case over here, that's something to use as a landmark for me, because that's where it's most clear that you're no longer at the hip box. This is kind of the start of where I understand drawing the legs as purely cylinders, as opposed to being connected to all the butt and hip area. Okay. So before we get down to the legs, I just want to finish up here a bit. So shoulders gonna still have that same kind of larger hump for that muscle, but less prominent on females. And then going down for the bicep, same idea, but instead of a larger hump, just it's a more gradual one. Elbow here, I always indicate it. Forearm, slimmer, but with the same, but you do need to indicate that small hump for the muscles there. And the hand, a female hand, the thing that I think is most common for the way that I draw it is that the fingers themselves, as opposed to being able to end in kind of like, blocky fingers for a male hand. I'm just going to draw a hand really quickly here. So with a male drawing, figure in a drawing, I will tend to not mind if the fingers are really, really blocky at the ends. But if I'm drawing a female hand, all the components I think of are the same, but I will make a conscious effort to make those fingers come to a finer point. It just needs to look more delicate and more dainty, I suppose. So I'll pay more attention to essentially just the end point of the fingers. And that's a male hand and a female hand. In this case here, we don't see too much of it, but I will just do something like that. Okay, same on the other side. here, this is the normal way I would draw a hand, which is thinking about that thumb, where the pinky is, and then just kind of connecting those lines in the middle, drawing the fingers last after understanding that box. Okay, so now to the legs. The legs, I think, are mostly informed by all the things that we did up here with the butt and the hips. And the thing that you want to do is you want to continue the trajectory of those lines. Whereas with the man, he kind of can have like a square, hard butt and really flat, thick, stocky legs. The female is going to more smoothly follow this line here. I mean, I suppose it jets out because of the butt sticking out, but the lines are just going to be a little bit more graceful. Otherwise, the same muscles being kind of indicated with like kind of a small sort of angle here or curve will be the same. Looks like I ran out of space for the foot, but I'm just going to do my best here because it is the same. I don't really handle feet too differently. If anything, the thing that I would keep in mind is the same concept here, where with a male foot I might be like, who cares? It can be really blocky, and it's just like a more manly foot. The more blocky it is. With a female foot, I will kind of try to make the whole thing sharper. So the ball of the foot doesn't really have much opportunity for that, but the heel of the foot I will make more slim, and as opposed to this kind of like harder heel, I will make a point of making that angle more narrow. Okay, so just going to mirror this leg here. And I made that leg a little short. And that is essentially the simplification of the female anatomy. So that concludes the lecture portion of the class. Let's move on to talk about your mission, which is to draw some rotations of the human form. The human body is just such a difficult thing to truly master that I want to give you guys the opportunity to practice it a bit more and to understand those basic shapes that it's comprised of and how they all fit together. So you will have 3 options for this mission, and let's go over what those options are. The first option is going to be to draw a robotic or armored character. This is kind of more on the mild medium end of the spectrum because a robot or an armored character is a lot more forgiving because the parts it's comprised of don't need to match exactly the human form. They can be kind of misshapen and placed slightly differently, but they do need to be generally the right types of shapes in the right places. So choose this option if you are feeling like you want to warm up to the human figure a little bit more slowly, or if your final illustration is going to use a character that's wearing armor or in a robotic suit. So for the second option, we have a simplified version of the human anatomy. None of the bones or muscles quite yet, but the lines that you're drawing here do need to kind of show a basic understanding of those underlying shapes. The last option is the human figure with all of the muscle groups showing, either male or female. And this is going to be helpful if you have a final illustration idea that might feature a more action-focused scene. Maybe the characters are flexing or having more skin showing. So if you really want to practice and build up your understanding of what the muscles are, obviously pick this one. So those are the 3 missions that you have available for today's lesson. Before we go, let's do a quick recap. Today's lesson was all about the human figure. We did a male and a female example, and I showed you my shorthand for understanding the human figure. But as you guys do the homework, you guys might come up with your own understanding, and that's great because really the goal of the class is for you to create an understanding that is most useful and readily available to you. And the next class, we'll be doing some additional posing with the human figure just to kind of get some practice on how to manipulate these shapes that we're building our understanding of. Looking forward to seeing you in the next class. See ya.